She arrived with everything she owned in one leather suitcase and $3.40 in her coat pocket. The man she had crossed 800 miles to marry had already married someone else. 3 weeks ago. Nobody had bothered to tell her. The station agent said it without looking up. Montana in November did not negotiate. The platform emptied. The train pulled away. And she sat alone in the cold with a return ticket she could not afford to use, and the particular silence of a woman who has just understood that she was never the point. That was the night a stranger stopped his wagon and said, "Don't sit alone, miss." She should have said no. She didn't. And what came after the ledgers, the land, the man who had planned it all from the beginning, none of it was what either of them expected. But some things, once started, cannot be stopped. You were never supposed to arrive. Roy Tibbett said it without looking up. Just read it off the page like a weather report. Like it was a fact about the world that had always been true, and Ada Vance was only now catching up to it. She stood on the platform of Red Willow Station with a leather suitcase at her feet and $3.40 in her coat pocket, and the silence of someone whose future had just been cancelled without the courtesy of a warning. The last passengers had already gone, collected their bags and their people, and disappeared into the kind of warmth that assumes you belong somewhere. The train had pulled away while she was still trying to understand what the station agent had said. Montana in November didn't wait for you to finish being devastated. The cold came off the mountains like it had somewhere to be. Roy Tibbett finally looked up. He had the face of a man who had delivered bad news so many times that his expressions had stopped trying to match the occasion. "Mr. Holt married a woman from Billings 3 weeks ago," he said again. Slower this time, like repetition was the same as kindness. "I don't know what he told you, miss, but he's not coming." Ada looked at the ticket in her hand. Return date stamped in ink, 1 week away, $7 to use it. She had $3.40. So she sat down on the bench at the edge of the platform and opened her suitcase and took out the last letter Douglas Holt had sent her and read it one more time in the fading November light. "With all my heart." She folded it, put it back, closed the suitcase, and then she sat very still and watched the last color drain out of the Montana sky and tried to think of a single person she could send a wire to. Her sister Dottie was 19 and living with their aunt in Laramie. Dottie had $40 saved toward a winter coat, and Ada was not going to be the reason she didn't get it. The boarding house on Callum Street had already rented her room to a seamstress from Denver. Ada had cleared it out herself 3 weeks ago. Packed everything she owned into one suitcase, told Dottie she'd send for her once she was settled, and boarded the westbound train with her chest so full of hope she'd had trouble sleeping. Because hope does that. It fills you up until there's no room for doubt. And then when the thing you were hoping for turns out to be a lie, there's nothing left to fill the space, just the shape of where it used to be. Ada pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and let herself cry. Not the kind of crying that releases anything. The silent kind, tears running down her face in the cold, while the empty platform stretched out in all directions, and she thought, maybe I should have known better. Maybe some people just aren't meant to be chosen. "Don't sit alone, miss." She looked up fast. A man stood several feet to her left, hat in hand, watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not pity. Not the careful performance of concern that men sometimes put on when they wanted something. Something else, recognition maybe. Like he already knew what this felt like from the inside. He was tall, lean in the way that came from actual labor. His coat was worn at the elbows. His boots were practical and scuffed, and had clearly walked a great many miles without being asked how they felt about it. Dark eyes. A jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. He was standing at what she would later understand was a deliberate distance. Close enough to be heard, far enough to be refused. "I'm fine." Ada wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Thank you. No, not unkind, just accurate, you're not." She blinked. People usually accepted "I'm fine" because it was easier than the alternative. "I didn't ask for company." "I know you didn't." He still hadn't moved closer. "But the station closes in an hour. Temperature's dropping another 15 degrees tonight. And I'd feel wrong leaving a woman alone out here with nowhere to go." Pause. "Unless you've got somewhere to go." Ada looked at the closed station door, the empty road beyond the platform, her suitcase, $3.40 in her pocket. "I don't know you. My name is Cole Whitmore." He nodded toward the road where a wagon was hitched to a patient brown horse. "I own a ranch about 4 miles north of town." Came in today for feed and supplies. Another pause. I've been standing by that wagon for 10 minutes trying to decide whether to mind my own business. Why didn't you? Something moved across his face, not quite a smile. Because I've been in a place like this before, not the same way, but the feeling of it. He looked at the ground briefly, the feeling that the world just went on without you while you were standing still. Ada stared at him. He was a stranger. She had just been destroyed by a man she had trusted through 6 months of letters and 1 train ticket, and what she'd believed was the beginning of something she had believed was real. Every reasonable thought she had told her to refuse. But reasonable thought hadn't gotten her very far lately. Why would you help a complete stranger? Cole Whitmore looked at her steadily. Because someone helped me when I had nothing, and I never got the chance to pay it back. The wagon ride was mostly silent. Ada sat on the bench beside Cole with her suitcase between her feet and watched the dark road unroll ahead of them. The horse moved at a steady pace. Cole didn't push it. He didn't fill the silence with questions either. She had braced for the inevitable. So what happened? Who was he? Why did you come all this way for a man you'd never met? But it didn't come. Cole drove his wagon and let her be quiet, and she discovered she had no idea what to do with that kind of consideration. After about a mile, she found herself saying it anyway. He lied to me. 6 months of letters, asked me to come, sent a train ticket. She laughed, short and without humor. Married someone else 3 weeks ago. Station agent told me before I'd been on the platform 5 minutes. I'm sorry. Cole's voice was even, not performing sympathy, just stating it. He didn't even bother to send a word. Just let me arrive. She shook her head. I don't understand how someone does that. Cole was quiet a moment. Some people decide other people don't matter before those other people even know the conversation is over. Ada turned to look at him. That's a very specific thing to say. I've thought about it some. He didn't elaborate. She faced forward again. The mountains were dark silhouettes against a sky thick with stars. She had never seen so many. Back in Laramie, the town lights ate them up. Out here they went all the way to the horizon. Like someone had decided there was no reason to hold back. I have $3.40, she said. The ticket home costs $7. I don't have anywhere to call home in Laramie anyway. My room's been taken. My sister has no space, and I won't ask her to try. She paused. I'm telling you this so you understand. I am not someone who takes charity. I am someone who is currently in a very bad position through absolutely no fault of any reasonable decision I made. Cole almost smiled. She saw it at the corner of his mouth. I believe you. I'll work. Whatever needs doing. I'm not afraid of hard work. I believe that too. I'm not staying indefinitely. I want to be clear about that. I don't want you thinking I'm trying to attach myself to Miss Vance. Not cutting her off. Just grounding her. Tonight there's a spare room and a hot meal. You can figure everything else out in the morning. Ada closed her mouth, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she stopped arguing. The ranch was small. She could see that even in the dark. The house itself was solid but weathered. The kind of solid that came from being built right the first time, and then left to face 30 years of Montana winters without apology. A barn to the left. A few outbuildings. Fencing that had seen better days but was still standing, which in November counted for something. Nothing about the place suggested prosperity. Everything about it suggested stubbornness, like it had simply refused to give up, and over time that had become its defining characteristic. She appreciated that more than she expected. Inside was plain and clean. A stone fireplace with a low fire already going. A table with 2 chairs. A small kitchen with a wood stove. Everything was functional and nothing was unnecessary, and it reminded Ada of her father before the bad years, when he'd built a life out of what was actually needed rather than what looked good. Cole put water on for coffee without asking if she wanted any. She sat at the table and looked at her hands. My wife died. He said it from the kitchen, no preamble, the way you stated a fact that explains something else you were about to say. 6 years ago, winter storm. I was out checking the far pasture when it came in fast. A pause while he watched the water. When I got back, she was gone. Ada looked up. He wasn't looking at her, still watching the water. I'm very sorry, she said. I kept the ranch. Didn't really know what else to do with myself. Work is useful that way. It doesn't care how you're feeling. It just keeps being necessary. He poured the coffee, brought 2 cups, sat down across from her. Point being, I know what it's like when the thing you were counting on isn't there anymore. Ada wrapped both hands around her cup. Your situation and mine aren't exactly the same. No, But the feeling of falling is pretty similar regardless of why. She looked at him across the table. Why are you telling me this? Because you're trying to figure out if you can trust me. And I thought it might help to know I have my own reasons for understanding what hard looks like. Ada studied him for a long moment. Do you have a lock on that spare room door? I'll put one on tonight if you need it. She studied him a moment more. Then she nodded once. Coffee's good. Cole almost smiled again. It's the one thing I've gotten right. He had the lock on in under 10 minutes, didn't make a production of it, just got his tools, did the work, showed her it functioned, said good night. Ada lay on the narrow bed in the dark and listened to the silence, and thought, how about how a person could do all the right things, and still end up here, in a stranger's spare room with nothing but a suitcase and a return ticket she couldn't afford to use. She had read Douglas Holt's letters 12 times before she wrote back. 12. She had counted them on the floor of her room at the boarding house, reading each one twice looking for inconsistencies, for anything that didn't hold together. She hadn't found any. His handwriting was careful and deliberate. The handwriting of a man who wanted you to believe he thought carefully about everything. He had written about his cattle and his land, and the way the valley looked in early morning when the mist hadn't lifted yet. He had written about wanting more than survival. He had written that he was a man who kept his promises, and she had believed him. Not because she was naive, because she was 24 years old and had spent 4 years being responsible for everyone else, and she was tired, and she needed to. Sometimes believing is an act of will rather than an act of evidence. She pressed her fingers against her eyes and breathed through the anger, not the grief anymore. Something sharper. The particular shape of fury that came from discovering you had been moved around like a piece on a board by someone who never once saw you as the player. You were never supposed to arrive. She thought about Cole saying, some people decide other people don't matter before those other people even know the conversation is over. He had said it with the quietness of someone who had learned that from experience, not from reading it somewhere, from living it. She didn't know what had happened to him beyond what he'd told her, but she understood enough to know he wasn't offering her shelter out of pity. He was offering it out of something more uncomfortable than pity. Recognition, and she could live with that. At least for tonight. She closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she slept without dreaming about what came next. Morning came with wood smoke and the sound of someone moving efficiently in another room. Ada was awake before sunrise, old habit from the boarding house years, and she washed her face from the basin on the dresser and pinned her hair and walked out into the main room to find Cole already at the stove. He glanced over his shoulder. Coffee's on. She poured herself a cup and leaned against the counter and watched him work. No wasted motion. The easy competence of a man who had done this particular series of tasks alone enough times that his hands knew what to do without consulting him. I'd like to help with breakfast. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She set down her cup. I'd like to. He looked at her a moment, then stepped aside and handed her the spatula. She took over the salt pork without discussion. And Cole started cutting bread, and they worked side by side in the small kitchen without speaking. And the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who each had enough to think about without needing to fill the air with noise. When they sat down to eat, Cole said, "What do you need?" Ada set down her fork. Not a small question. She could hear that he meant it as one. I need to earn enough to get back to Laramie, or somewhere. I'm good with sewing. I can cook. I can keep accounts. I did the books for the boarding house for 2 years. I can work with animals if someone shows me what to do. Cole listened without interrupting. I need someone to help run the house, he said, and someone who can handle the supply records, the feed costs, the vendor accounts. I've been keeping them in my head for 2 years, which is no way to run a business. I can do that. I pay fair wages, room and board, and $2 a week until you've got what you need to figure out next steps. Ada looked at him. That's generous. It's fair. He went back to his breakfast. Different thing. She thought about it for 4 seconds. All right. I'll stay until I've got enough to figure out what comes next. Cole nodded, and neither of them acknowledged that what comes next was considerably less certain for either of them than they were letting on. The first week was work. Ada discovered 3 things quickly, and they arranged themselves in her mind like columns in a ledger: what the situation was, what it meant, and what needed to be done about it. The first thing was that the ranch was struggling. Not failing, not yet. But the margin between struggling and failing was thin enough that every week mattered. The cattle on the east pasture were carrying too little weight for the amount of supplemental feed Cole was buying. The fencing on the east boundary needed repair before the hard freeze set in. The records Cole had been keeping in his head were giving him a false picture of where the money was actually going. Because the human mind naturally smooths out irregularities that a ledger does not. How long have you been losing money on the east pasture cattle? Ada asked him on the third day. She was sitting at the table with his scattered receipts and notes spread in front of her, organized now into something that could actually be read. Cole looked up from the harness he was repairing. I haven't been losing. You have. She turned the ledger so he could see. You're spending about 30% more on supplemental feed for those animals than they return in value. The east pasture grass is too poor. Move them to the north pasture. Better grass quality, less supplement needed. You'd save close to $8 a month. He stared at the numbers. Nobody told me that. Nobody's been looking. She turned the ledger back. The information was here. It just wasn't in any order anyone could read. Cole looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he looked at her, said nothing, went back to the harness. But the next morning the east pasture cattle were being moved north. Ada noted this and said nothing about it, and understood that this was probably how Cole Whitmore operated, not with discussion, with action. The second thing she discovered was the town of Red Willow and its opinions. Nora Briggs arrived on the fourth day with a basket of preserved plum and an expression of elaborate casualness that didn't fool Ada for a second. Nora was the wife of the man who ran the feed and dry goods store, somewhere around 50, with quick eyes and the particular gift of people who processed information through conversation rather than solitude. We heard there was a young woman staying out at the Whitmore place, Nora said, sitting at the table with her hands folded. Everyone just wanted to make sure you were. A pause waited with implications settled. I'm working, Ada said. Keeping the accounts and managing the house. Of course. Nora looked around the kitchen with the attention of someone cataloging evidence. And how long do you expect? As long as necessary. Another look around the kitchen. You know, Douglas Holt is a very well-respected man in this county. Ada looked at her steadily. Is that right? What happened between you two? These things are complicated. Men sometimes have obligations that Mrs. Briggs. Ada's voice stayed pleasant. Entirely pleasant. I appreciate you coming by. Please take some coffee before you go. Nora left an hour later, with her basket and her opinions and several things to report to people who hadn't asked her. Ada stood at the window and watched the wagon disappear down the road and thought about the phrase well-respected. Cole came in from the barn. What did she want? To see if I was decent. What did you tell her? I gave her coffee and let her look. Ada turned from the window. Is Douglas Holt actually respected here? Something shifted in Cole's face. He has money, he said. In this county, people confuse those two things. Ada filed that away. It would matter later. She didn't know yet how much. The third thing she discovered was the kitchen garden, or the absence of one. There was a good patch of ground along the south side of the house, sheltered from the worst of the wind, with soil that looked workable even at the end of November. Ada found a tin of old seeds in the back of the pantry: carrot, turnip, onion. Nothing would take this late in the season, but there was enough here to plan for spring. She started clearing the space anyway, because the work needed doing, and because doing it gave her something to look at that wasn't her suitcase. Cole stood in the kitchen doorway one evening, watching her work the frozen edge of the soil. You don't have to do that. The space is going to waste. Vegetables are cheaper grown than bought. She sat back on her heels. Is there a reason it wasn't planted? Cole was quiet. Planting something takes hope, he said. That it'll come up, that you'll be here to see it. Ada looked at him. And you didn't think you would be. He was quiet again, longer this time. Didn't think it mattered either way. It matters. She turned back to the soil and drove the trowel in. Cole stood in the doorway for another moment without answering. Then he walked back inside, but that evening he came in from the barn earlier than usual and sat at the table while she was making supper without any particular explanation, and after a while he said, without apparent reason, there's a perennial patch on the south side. Iris bulbs. My wife planted them the first spring we were here. Ada didn't look up from the stove. Do they still come up? I've thought about pulling them out. Why? A long pause. Grief gets into habits. After a while the habit feels like the only way to keep holding on. Don't pull them, Ada said. Cole didn't answer. But in the morning, when Ada walked the south side of the house, she saw that someone had cleared the winter debris from around the bulbs, carefully, without making a point of it. She didn't mention it, but she noticed, and noticing it did something to the locked-down, careful part of her chest that she had been guarding since November. 3 weeks into her stay, Ada took the wagon into town for supplies. Cole had taught her how to handle the horse, and she had taken to it the way she took to most practical things, by watching once and then doing it. She made her list. She drove the smaller wagon herself. She was in the dry goods store, comparing the price of 2 grades of flour, when she heard footsteps in the aisle behind her, and turned around. The man standing there was well dressed by any frontier standard. Good wool coat, good boots, a face that had probably been called handsome once and now wore something harder, more calculated. He was smiling, but the smile was the kind that had been deployed so many times it had stopped requiring any internal cooperation. His eyes were doing something entirely separate from his mouth. "Miss Vance." He extended his hand. "Douglas Holt, I heard you arrived." The floor did not literally fall out from under Ada, but that was the most accurate description of the sensation. She did not take his hand. She did not step back. She held very still the way she had learned to hold still under pressure. The way her father had taught her without meaning to, when he was deep in his losing years, and the only useful thing Ada could do was stay calm and count the numbers correctly. "Mr. Holt," she said. His smile adjusted slightly, recalibrated. "I'm sorry about the confusion between us. The timing of things communication can break down." There wasn't any confusion. Her voice was level, entirely level. "You sent for me. You sent a train ticket. You wrote for 6 months. Then you married someone else and didn't bother to send a single word. That isn't confusion, that's a decision." The smile tightened at the corners. "A man's circumstances change. I hope you don't hold that against me. I hold it against you, precisely as much as it deserves." She looked at him steadily. "Which I suspect is more than you're comfortable with." Something moved in his expression. Gone in an instant, replaced by the smile again, but she had seen it. Not embarrassment, not remorse, calculation. Pure and clean as arithmetic. "I understand you've made yourself at home at Cole Whitmore's ranch," Holt said. "Still pleasant, still smooth. Word gets around in a small town. If you find that his circumstances prove insufficient, I do have connections in this county. I could find you something more suitable." Ada looked at him. "I have a suitable position." "Ada, Miss Vance," she said, "you don't have the right to my given name." The smile disappeared completely, and in that moment she saw what was underneath it. Not a man who had simply changed his mind. A man who had never once been uncertain about what he intended. A man who was used to moving people around and was now recalculating, because one of the pieces had moved on its own. "Give Cole my regards," Holt said. The smile recovered. He walked away. Ada stood in the dry goods store with her list in her hand, and her heart going faster than she wanted to admit, and made herself breathe. Slow. Measured. The way she counted numbers when a column wasn't balancing, and she knew the error was in there somewhere, and she just needed to look at each figure one at a time, without jumping to conclusions. "Give Cole my regards." Not a pleasantry. Something else dressed as one. She put the list back in her pocket and finished her shopping. She drove the wagon home faster than she usually did, which the horse did not appreciate, and she apologized to the horse out loud, because she needed to say something out loud, and the horse was the only one available. Cole was in the barn when she got back. She put the horse up and carried the supplies inside, and set the flour and the salt on the shelf and hung up her coat. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and looked at 3 weeks of careful work spread in front of her. Ledgers, receipts, vendor invoices. The pattern of costs and returns she had been building one number at a time, and now they looked different. Not just a ranch struggling to be profitable. A target being prepared for purchase by someone who had done this before, by someone who knew exactly how much pressure to apply and where to apply it, and how long to let it build before the next step. And Ada had been part of the setup. She understood that now with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with arithmetic. If she had arrived and created a scandal, Cole's name in this county took damage by association. The mail-order bride who came to marry Douglas Holt ends up instead at the bachelor rancher's place. People talk. Suddenly Cole Whitmore's character is in question, and his business relationships get harder, and the thin margin between struggling and failing gets thinner. It cost Holt nothing to set that up. It cost him nothing to send those letters, to invite her, to simply not cancel her ticket. He didn't need her to marry him. He just needed her to arrive, and she had. Cole came in from the barn 20 minutes later, pulling off his work gloves. He read her face before she spoke. What happened? I ran into Douglas Holt at the dry goods store. Cole went completely still. Not the stillness of surprise. The stillness of a man who had been expecting something and was disappointed it had finally arrived. Where? He introduced himself, very pleasant about it. Said he was sorry about the confusion between us. Ada kept her voice flat. Offered to find me a more suitable position if your circumstances proved insufficient. Cole crossed to the table and sat down across from her. For a moment he just looked at his hands. Tell me about the land, Ada said. And Cole told her. About the railroad survey. About the spur line that would triple land values in the North Valley when it came through. About Holt buying up parcels for 2 years through different names so no one noticed the pattern. About the 2 approaches he'd made to Cole directly, each time politely refused. And about what came after each refusal. The feed supplier who suddenly couldn't fill orders. The bank that got slow about processing the account. Nothing you could point at directly. Nothing that would hold up if you said it out loud. Pressure, Ada said. The subtle kind. Cole looked at the table. The kind that's hard to fight because there's nothing to grab onto. How bad is it? I'm managing, Cole. The way she said his name made him look up, direct. Not softened. The way you said someone's name when you needed them to hear the actual question. How bad is it? Tight, he said. Tighter than I've let on. If 2 or 3 more things go wrong in the same season, I might not have enough to cover both the mortgage payment and operating costs. Ada looked at the ledger on the table between them. 3 weeks of numbers. 3 weeks of her own careful work. And now they looked like something different than she'd thought they were. He used me. It came out quiet, flat. The letters, the invitation, the train ticket. She pressed her fingers flat against the table. If I'd arrived and created a scandal here, the abandoned mail-order bride who ends up at the bachelor rancher's place, your reputation in this county takes damage by association. Your business relationships get harder. The margin gets thinner. Cole stared at her. I didn't think of it that way. I did, just now. But it makes sense. She shook her head. He didn't need me to marry him. He just needed me to arrive. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the eaves with a sound like something settling into a longer patience. Ada, Cole said carefully. You don't have to be part of this. She looked at him. I'm already part of it. He made me part of it the moment he sent that first letter. Cole held her gaze and didn't argue. Because she was right and he knew it. And Ada looked at the ledger on the table and felt the anger she'd been carrying since the train station changed shape. Not smaller. Sharper. More useful. The kind that didn't need a place to go because it already knew where it was pointing. She picked up her pen. She opened the ledger to a fresh page, and she began. The second ledger started before breakfast. Cole found her at the table at first light, with a fresh notebook open and her pen already moving, and he stood in the kitchen doorway in his work coat, with his hat in his hand, and read her face and understood without being told that something had shifted in the night. Not her mood, her direction. What's that? Everything you can remember about the feed supplier, dates, names, what changed and when. She didn't look up. And the bank. Who handles your account? Who you spoke to? What exactly they said. Cole poured his coffee and sat down and told her. All of it. The order from Hartwell's feed that came back declined in September with no explanation after 8 years of reliable business. The letter from the Red Willow County Bank in October, asking him to come in and discuss his account. And the meeting with Warren Pruitt that produced nothing specific except a general atmosphere of concern that Cole couldn't name or challenge. The fencing supplies that the hardware store said were back ordered, but that Ruth Danvers' husband had managed to buy the same week from the same supplier without difficulty. Ada wrote it all down, not in her careful accounting hand, faster, like she was trying to get the shape of something onto the page before it moved. By the time breakfast was ready, they had 6 pages. She cooked with the notebook beside her and glanced at it, while the salt pork crisped, and Cole cut bread and the kitchen filled with the kind of ordinary warmth that had no business being as complicated as it felt. Because this was not a complicated situation, Ada told herself. It was a practical one. A man's property was being squeezed by a systematic and dishonest operator, and she had the skills to document it. That was all this was. Except she had also, at some point between November and now, started thinking of Cole's ranch as a place worth protecting rather than a temporary arrangement. And that was worth noticing, even if she chose not to examine it too closely. They ate. Cole asked her what she needed from Nora Briggs's husband at the feed store for the week. She told him. He wrote it on his own list in handwriting that was large and honest, and bore no relationship whatsoever to what he actually meant to spend. And Ada did not say anything about the fact that being useful felt more like belonging than anything she had experienced in 4 years. Because saying it out loud would require deciding what to do about it. The notice arrived on a Thursday morning. Ada answered the door, because Cole was in the barn and the knock came 3 times in the particular rhythm of official business rather than neighborly visits. The man on the step was middle-aged and wore his coat like a uniform, even though it wasn't one. Leather satchel. Papers under his arm. The expression of someone whose job required him to be the messenger for things that were not his fault. "I have a notice for Cole Whitmore. He's in the barn. Can I help you?" Notice from the Red Willow County Bank. He produced it and held it out with the efficiency of a man who had learned not to make eye contact during this part. Ada took it. Read it standing in the doorway. Read it again. Accelerated repayment. The full balance of Cole's 15-year mortgage. Called in under a clause that allowed the bank to demand complete payment within 90 days if the bank president determined the property showed evidence of declining value. Signed by Warren Pruitt. Her hands did not shake. She made sure of that. Who authorized the declining value determination? "Mr. Pruitt, ma'am. Has Mr. Whitmore missed any payments?" "Not that I'm aware." "Has he violated any term of the original agreement?" "Not as such." The man shifted his weight. "I just deliver the notices, ma'am." Ada looked at the paper one more time. Then she looked at the man. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was entirely steady. "I'll see that he receives it." She closed the door, stood in the entryway for exactly 30 seconds and let herself feel the full weight of what she was holding. Not panic. Ada did not panic, but she allowed the reality of it to land completely before she moved, because people who rushed toward crisis without first understanding its shape usually made it worse. 90 days. Full mortgage repayment. No missed payments, no violations. Douglas Holt had stopped being patient. Cole read the notice at the kitchen table. Twice. His jaw tightened on the second read in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. He set it down flat on the table and looked at it the way a man looked at a thing he had been expecting and had hoped he was wrong about. 90 days. Yes. I can't pay off the mortgage in 90 days, I know. If you can't pay, he buys the note at auction. Below market value. Then he owns the land. Cole looked at her. You already worked through it. Before I brought it to the barn. I needed to understand it before I told you. She let him sit with that for a moment. There's a declining value clause in the original mortgage agreement, which means someone had to establish that the property value was declining before Pruitt could invoke it. That doesn't happen overnight. Cole stood up, walked to the window, stood there with his back to her and both hands at his sides, very still, the way he went still when something was being held on a short leash inside him. 6 years, he said, not to her, to the window, or maybe to the land beyond it. I built this back up for 6 years after he stopped. Ada waited after June. I know, she said. Cole turned around. His expression had the controlled flatness of a man who had decided how much to show and was holding the line on it. What do we do? And Ada noticed the we, did not comment on it. But she noticed it, and it settled somewhere in her chest like a fact about the world that had been waiting to be acknowledged. First, I need to understand the basis for the declining value determination. The notice mentions it, but doesn't specify source. Someone told the bank the property value was falling. She tapped the notice with one finger. Chester Doan at the county assessor's office. Has the assessment on your land changed recently? Cole frowned. They sent a reassessment notice 2 months ago. I thought it was routine. Signed the new assessed value. Lower than before, significantly. Ada closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. They manufactured the declining value, she said. Someone arranged for a downward reassessment. Then Pruitt used that reassessment to justify invoking the acceleration clause. She pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose. Cole. This was set up months before the bank sent this notice. The reassessment had to come first. Which means Holt started this particular sequence of steps long before he approached you the second time. Cole stared at her. He planned the whole thing. At minimum 6 months of planning, possibly more. She picked up her pen. I need to talk to Chester Doan. She went the next morning. Alone, which Cole argued against in the quiet way he argued against things he knew he had no actual authority over. Ada drove the wagon into town before the feed store opened and found the county assessor's office in a narrow building between the post office and the land records room, and she sat down across from Chester Doan and folded her hands on his desk and smiled at him with the pleasantness that she had learned was more effective than aggression when dealing with men who were not certain they were on solid ground. I need to understand the basis for the recent reassessment of Cole Whitmore's property. Doan was somewhere in his 50s, a paper-shuffling man with reading spectacles and the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to keep his own opinions from showing on his face. Assessments are routine, Miss Vance, and this one wasn't. The assessed value dropped by nearly a third in a single cycle. That requires documentation of cause. I'd like to see the documentation. There were concerns raised about the profitability of the operation, reports suggesting it was underperforming relative to comparable properties in the county. What reports? From whom? Doan shuffled papers. I don't have the specific source immediately to hand. Ada leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, just closing the distance enough that the conversation became impossible to treat as routine. Mr. Doan, someone told you Cole Whitmore's ranch was underperforming. I would like to know who, because I have 3 months of supply costs, livestock records, and income projections, showing this property is not only performing comparably to similar operations in this county, but improving month over month. She placed her folder of copied ledger pages on his desk. I am prepared to formally challenge the reassessment on this basis. I would prefer to understand the source of the original concern before I do. Doan looked at the folder, looked at her. Who exactly are you, Miss Vance? The person keeping the accounts. She didn't win the meeting. She hadn't expected to win it on the first visit, but she watched Doan's face while he looked at her documentation, and she saw something shift in his expression. Not agreement, doubt. He wasn't certain anymore that the ground he was standing on was as solid as he'd assumed, and a man who wasn't certain didn't commit further. He stalled, he delayed. He waited to see which direction the situation moved before he leaned into it, which meant they had more time than the notice suggested, not much more. But some. She drove back through town and stopped at the feed store. Nora Briggs looked up from behind the counter with the expression of a woman who had been expecting this visit and had been rehearsing her responses. Ada had learned to read Nora Briggs accurately now. Generous with information when she felt she was on the right side of something. Cautious when she wasn't sure which side she was on. Mrs. Briggs, I owe you an apology for being short with you when you came by. I was defending myself by instinct. You were trying to be neighborly. Nora blinked. This was apparently not one of the responses she had rehearsed for. Well, these things happen. Could I ask you something directly, I suppose? How many properties has Douglas Holt acquired in this county in the last 2 years? A long pause. Nora looked at the door, then back at Ada. That's not the kind of question most people ask directly. I'm not most people. Another pause. Then quietly 7 that we know about. 2 of them were through a land company out of the state capital. Different name. But the money traces back to Holt if you follow it carefully enough. Ada kept her expression neutral, kept her voice even. And the families who sold. The Danvers lost their place last spring. Mortgage called in sudden, same as what I hear is happening to Cole. Nora lowered her voice further. The Danvers didn't have anyone looking at their books for them. By the time they understood what was happening, they were already 3 weeks past the point where anything could have been done. Ada felt that land, the precision of it. 3 weeks past the point where anything could have been done. Because no one had been looking at the pattern. No one had connected the Danvers to whoever came before them, or understood that the sequence of events wasn't random misfortune, but a deliberate mechanism being run against property after property in the same order every time. Could I speak with Ruth Danver? Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached under the counter and pulled out her stool. Sit down, she said. This is going to take a few minutes. 6 more pages of notes. Ada drove home faster than the horse preferred, and apologized less than she had the last time, because she was thinking too hard to spare the courtesy. Ruth Danver wrote back in 4 days. Ada had half-expected silence. People who had been burned rarely wanted to walk back into the fire just to describe the heat. But Ruth Danver's letter arrived on a Monday morning, and Ada read it standing at the kitchen table before she'd taken off her coat. 2 pages of tight, deliberate handwriting from a woman who had been waiting for a specific reason to be angry rather than just a general one. Ruth described everything. The assessor's visit. The bank notice 3 weeks later. The meeting with Warren Pruitt, who had been sympathetic and immovable in equal measure, the way only a man following instructions could be. The moment her husband went to Holt directly, and Holt had expressed deep personal regret and offered to take the property at 60 cents on the dollar as a personal favor to avoid the embarrassment of auction, the way they'd had no real choice by then. And at the bottom, in writing that pressed harder into the paper than the rest, "If you are truly trying to stop this man, tell me what you need and I will give it to you." Ada set the letter down. "Cole," he was in from the south fence, still pulling his gloves off. "We have a witness." Cole read Ruth's letter, read it twice, set it on the table. She lost her place. Last same sequence. Assessment. Bank notice. Holt's offer. No real alternative. Ada looked at him. "She's not the only one. Nora said there are others. I need to reach them." Cole sat down slowly. There was something in his face that hadn't been there a week ago. Not fear. Something more complicated. The expression of a man recalibrating the size of the thing he was standing in the middle of. He's been running this on the whole county. At least 7 properties. Possibly more that weren't identified as connected. Ada spread her notes on the table. Each family saw their own problem as their own problem. Nobody put them in the same room and compared what happened to them. Nobody connected the assessment dates to the bank notices to the timing of Holt's purchase offers. She looked up. "That's what we're going to do." Cole looked at the notes. Looked at her. "Ada, why are you doing this?" She blinked. "What do you mean? This isn't your fight. You arrived here with a suitcase and 340. You don't owe this county anything. You don't owe me anything." His voice was careful, deliberate, like he meant the words as a genuine release and not as a way of pushing her out. "You could take your wages, save up, and be back in Laramie by spring. Because he used me." The words came out harder than she'd intended, like they'd been under pressure. "He put me in those letters. He moved me across 800 miles like a piece on a board, without my knowledge and without my consent. He made me part of a plan I didn't know I was in." She held Cole's gaze and didn't soften it. "I don't let that go." Cole was very still. "Also," Ada said, slightly quieter, "this is the first time in 4 years I've felt like I was doing something that actually mattered." So the corner of Cole's mouth moved, not quite a smile. Something more honest than a smile. "You are the most relentless woman I have ever met. I prefer thorough." She picked up her pen. "Can we go over the timeline again? I need the exact dates of both of Holt's approaches before I write to anyone else." Holt moved faster than they had planned for. Cole came home from the hardware store on a Tuesday and told her about it that evening, with the flat economy of a man reporting facts rather than dramatizing them. Holt had been there, presented himself as a concerned neighbor, expressed regret that Cole had gotten himself into a difficult situation, said that the offer he'd already made was the best Cole would see, and that a trial in this county went before a judge who had known Holt for 15 years, and that Cole ought to consider carefully who he was making enemies of and why. Cole had said, "Then we'll see what 15 years of friendship is worth against documented fraud." Ada listened to all of this. When Cole finished, she said he mentioned the judge. By implication, not directly. "We need to know who the presiding judge is for county civil cases, and whether there's a basis to request a change of venue." She pressed her fingers together. "Holt has been operating in this county for 2 years through unofficial channels. That means he spent 2 years building unofficial relationships. We cannot assume the courtroom is neutral." Cole looked at her with an expression she had learned to read over the past weeks, the one that meant he was managing a stronger response than he wanted to show. "This is getting larger than either of us planned." "Yes." "Are you?" He started, stopped, started again. "Is this still something you want to be part of? You came here with nothing and somehow ended up in the middle of a legal case that has nothing to do with Cole." She set down her pen. "Look at me." He looked at her. "I am not leaving. I am not stepping back. I am not going to be frightened off by a man implying things in a hardware store." She held his gaze without wavering. "And I need you to stop asking me if I'm sure. Because every time you ask, it sounds like you're giving me permission to go. And I don't need your permission. I need your trust." The kitchen was very quiet. A log shifted in the fireplace. Outside, the December wind pressed against the house with the patience of something that would still be there in the morning. "You have it," Cole said, simply. "You've had it for a while now. Good." She picked up the pen. He sat down across from her. Neither of them said anything else, but he stayed at the table. And that, Ada had learned, was Cole Whitmore's way of saying everything he couldn't find words for. She wrote to James Aldred that night. Aldred was an attorney in Billings who had won a property fraud case 3 years prior involving a similar mechanism, inflated debt claims used to force sales, and Ada had found his name in a county land dispute summary Nora Briggs had mentioned without realizing she was handing over something useful. Ada wrote clearly, stated the facts without embellishment, attached a summary of the documented transactions and a timeline, asked for a consultation. Then she sealed it and set it by the door, and then she sat for a moment with her hand flat on the table and looked at what she had built from nothing. A second ledger, 50 pages of notes, a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight for 2 years because no one had looked at it from the outside. A network of damaged families who had been alone with their damage until now. Cole found the letter by the door in the morning. Read the name on the envelope, Aldred in Billings. He beat a similar case 3 years ago. If anyone knows how to challenge what Holt is doing through proper legal channels, it's him. Cole set the letter down carefully. An attorney in Billings is going to cost money that. Let me worry about that, Ada. You're not paying for a legal defense out of your Cole. She looked at him directly. You gave me a room with a lock on the door and fair wages and didn't ask anything in return when I had nothing at all. Let me do this. A pause. Please. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the letter. All right. Then he picked it up. Ada, he said. She looked at him. He put it in his coat pocket without finishing the sentence. She understood anyway. Ada watched him go and felt the quiet, specific weight of a man choosing to trust. That evening she found him standing outside the barn in the early dark, looking south toward the mountains. She had started to go back inside when he spoke without turning around. June was from Missouri. Did I tell you that? She stayed where she was. No, she'd never seen mountains before she came here. First winter she kept going outside just to look at them. He was quiet a moment. She said they made her feel like the world was bigger than anything that could go wrong in it. Ada stood in the cold and didn't say anything because he wasn't done. I haven't looked at them that way in 6 years. He turned around then, and in the low light his expression was unguarded in a way she had not seen before, not performing anything, not holding anything back. Just a man saying a true thing. I look at them now sometimes, and I think I almost understand what she meant again. Ada looked at him, and she felt something she had spent weeks being very careful not to name. That's not a small thing, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. No, Cole said. It's not. Aldred's reply arrived 11 days later. He had independently pulled county land records in Red Willow on the basis of Ada's documentation. He believed there was a case. He was prepared to make the trip from Billings on the 20th if she could arrange meetings with the affected parties. And regarding his fee, he would consider the full consultation waived if they proceeded to litigation and prevailed. Ada read the letter twice. Then she walked to the barn doorway. Aldred is coming. Cole looked up from a length of fence wire he was repairing. He read her face before she said anything else. Then she handed him the letter, and he read it, and his expression went through several things in quick succession, ending in something she could only describe as a man letting himself believe something he'd been afraid to believe. A real attorney, in the county. With Holt's full transaction history and statements from 3 affected families, it's not a sure thing, but it's real. Ada watched him. We're not alone in this anymore. Cole set the letter down carefully. He was quiet for a long moment. When he looked up, something in his face had shifted from the controlled steadiness she'd grown used to into something rawer and more honest. This place, he said. 6 years I kept it going because I didn't know what else to do with myself. June loved this land. She used to say it felt like it had been waiting for her. He stopped, drew a breath. I can't lose it to a man who wants it for a railroad profit. You're not going to. You can't know that. No, Ada said. But I know we have better evidence than he expected, and a lawyer who has beaten this before, and families who are angry enough to testify. She looked at him steadily. And I know that Douglas Holt built this entire plan on the assumption that the people standing in his way would each feel alone in it. We are not alone. Cole looked at her. It was the kind of look that lasted a moment too long to be casual, the kind that meant something was being decided behind it. No, he said quietly. We're not. And Ada looked back at him and did not look away and understood that she was not, in fact, as careful about this as she had been telling herself for weeks. Which was a problem she would deal with later, after Holt, after the case, after the land was safe and the families had their restitution, and there was nothing left to fight. She went inside and picked up her pen and kept working. Holt moved the way he always moved, through layers, through other people, through the social machinery of a small county where reputation was the only currency that mattered, and he had been spending it carefully for 2 years. The story he told was simple. He wasn't attacking Ada directly. That would have been clumsy, too easy to refute, beneath the operational standard he had maintained since the beginning. What he did instead was quieter, and in many ways more effective. He went from conversation to conversation expressing concern, genuine, personal, neighborly concern for Cole Whitmore, who had been alone too long, and was clearly not thinking clearly, because what kind of man let a woman who had arrived under those particular circumstances take over his accounts and his household, and insert herself into a legal matter that had nothing to do with her, unless he was too worn down by grief to see what was happening right in front of him. He never said manipulator. He never said scheming. He said worried, and he let the word do its work. Nora Briggs came to Ada on a Wednesday morning with the expression of a woman delivering something she wished she didn't have to carry. There's talk. Low and fast, the voice of someone who had decided to be useful rather than tactful. Holt is telling people, not directly, you understand how he operates. He just tells them he's concerned about Cole. That a young woman with nowhere to go, arriving the way you did, taking over the way you have. People fill in the rest themselves. Ada stood very still. Half the town heard it by yesterday evening, Nora continued. He's careful about it. He uses words like worried and understandable and lonely man. Nothing you could grab onto directly and argue against, and there it was. The whole shape of it, every page she had documented, every letter she had written, every hour building the case fact by careful fact. And Holt's answer was to make Ada herself the question. Because if people were asking who is Ada Vance instead of what did Douglas Holt do, then nothing she had built mattered. The jury was being assembled in the feed store and the post office, and on front steps before a single document was ever presented in a formal proceeding. She felt the anger move through her, not hot, cold, clarifying the way cold things clarified. Thank you, she told Nora, for telling me. She walked out of the store and stood on the main road of Red Willow in the December cold and looked at the community hall 2 buildings down and made a decision in approximately 4 seconds. She found the first person she recognized and asked him to please let people know that Ada Vance would be at the community hall at 4 o'clock that afternoon if anyone wanted to hear her speak. Then she went back to the ranch to get her ledger. Cole was working the east boundary fence. She passed him on the wagon and raised her hand and kept moving, because if she stopped and told him what she was about to do, he would want to come with her, and she needed to do this herself. Not because she didn't trust him, because she needed to be the one standing in that room alone, answering for herself and no one else. 31 people came. She had hoped for 15 and braced herself for 7. 31 people filed into the community hall at 4 o'clock on a cold December afternoon. And Ada Vance walked to the front of the room with her ledger under one arm and her notes in her other hand, and the full knowledge that what she was about to do could not be undone. She told them about the night she arrived at the station. She told them about Roy Tibbet and his ledger and the words he said without looking up. She told them about the kitchen at Cole's ranch and the room with the lock on the door and the coffee, which was the one thing he had gotten right. She told them about 3 months of supply records and livestock assessments, and the pattern that had been sitting in the county land records for 2 years, waiting for someone to put it all in the same room as itself. She was 10 minutes in when Dale Peck stood up. Dale Peck was one of Holt's tenant farmers, broad across the shoulders, somewhere in his 40s, with the face of a man who had worked hard all his life, and did not appreciate having the terms of that life questioned by someone he didn't know. He had the look of a man who had already decided his position before he stood up and was now performing the motions of debate. Mr. Holt has been a fair landlord to this county for going on 15 years, he said, his voice carried. He meant it to. You've been here 3 months, and you want us to take a stranger's word and a stranger's ledger over a man's reputation that's been built right here in front of us. The room shifted. Ada felt it the way you felt a boat tilt. Several people nodded. Two in the back row exchanged a look. Dale Peck sat down with the satisfied posture of a man who believed he had just ended something. Ada looked at him directly. "I don't want you to take my word for anything," she said. Her voice was level and she made no effort to raise it. The room quieted to hear her. "I want you to look at the paper." She set the ledger on the table beside her. "Mr. Peck, you are a tenant on Holt land. Is that correct?" "It is." "When did you last renew your lease?" He told her the date. "And when was the reassessment filed on the Danver property, which borders the land Holt acquired last spring?" She opened the ledger to the second page and turned it so the front row could see. Column 7. "The date is right there. 11 days before your lease renewal." Silence. "I'm not saying your lease means you're next," Ada said. "I'm not saying anything about you specifically, Mr. Peck. I'm saying the pattern is documented. It exists whether anyone in this room looks at it or not." She held his gaze steady. "I'm asking you to look, that's all." Dale Peck looked at the ledger, then at his hands, then at the ledger again. He sat down the way a man sat down when the ground had moved under him, and sitting was the only response that didn't require him to decide immediately what he thought about it. Ruth Danver stood up from the second row. She had the posture of a woman who had been waiting 6 months for something precise enough to be worth standing up for. "I'll confirm everything on those pages," Ruth said. "Every date, every sequence. It happened to us exactly the way she's described it. The assessor came first, then the bank notice, then Holt's offer. Already written up, already ready, like he knew we'd have no choice before we knew it ourselves." She looked around the room. "We didn't understand what was happening until it was already done. She's the one who showed us the shape of it." Margaret Price stood up behind her, then Tom Waverley, who was 70 years old and had sold his own property under quiet pressure, 6 months before the Danvers lost theirs, and who had spent those 6 months being ashamed of it instead of angry, and who now had somewhere specific to put the anger and was not going to waste the opportunity. Ada looked out at 31 faces. Some were closed, some were calculating. But some, and this was the ones that mattered, were awake. The kind of awake that happened when a person that happened had been carrying a half-formed suspicion for a long time, and someone had just given it a shape they could actually look at. "Douglas Holt is telling people I am a manipulator," Ada said. "He is saying I used a grieving man's loneliness to advance my own position. He is saying these things because the alternative is answering the evidence, and he cannot answer the evidence." She let that land before she continued. "I came to this county with nothing. I came because a man made me a promise and then decided I didn't matter enough to keep it. And the first person who treated me like I did matter, like I was worth a fair wage in a room with a lock on the door and basic human decency, was Cole Whitmore, who is now the target of the same kind of man who used me to try to damage him." The hall was very quiet. "I am not here to ask you to feel sorry for me," Ada said. "I am here to show you the record, every transaction, every date, every name, because what happened to the Danvers and the Prices and Tom Waverley happened in a specific sequence, and that sequence is documented, and it will happen again to someone else in this county, if it isn't stopped." She looked across the room one more time. "I don't need you to believe me because I'm sympathetic. I need you to look at the paper." She opened the ledger and started reading. Cole found out at 6 o'clock when Ruth Danver rode out to tell him. He stood in the barn doorway and listened, and his expression moved through several things in quick succession: alarm, then something that might have been awe, then something that settled into a steady, deliberate warmth. "She did that alone," he said, "walked in there by herself and talked for 40 minutes. By the end, people were asking good questions. The kind Holt doesn't want anyone asking." Cole was already untying his horse. He met Ada's wagon on the road halfway back to the ranch, pulled his horse alongside in the last of the December light, and looked at her face, which was tired and flushed and entirely undefeated. "You went to the community hall." He was going to let his version of the story set overnight. "I couldn't let it set. You should have told me. You would have come with me." "Yes," Cole said. "I would have." Ada looked at him in the cold evening air. "I needed to do it myself." He held her gaze, steady in the way he was steady when something mattered enough to be worth the honesty. "Yes, I understand that exactly." They rode back together in the falling dark without speaking, but the silence between them had changed again, into something neither of them was quite ready to name, but both of them felt with the same certainty as the frozen ground under them, and the dark outline of the mountains ahead. The filing happened on the 8th of December. Aldred had arrived 2 days prior, reviewed Ada's full assembled documentation at the kitchen table for the better part of a day, conferred with Frank Cutter, through a colleague in Billings, and declared the case ready to proceed. What we have, Aldred told them, is documented fraudulent property devaluation for the purpose of triggering mortgage acceleration, combined with coordinated purchasing through concealed entities and written direction from Holt personally to Cutter regarding which documents to notarize and when. Civil fraud on one level, criminal conspiracy on another. Cutter's cooperation changed the shape of everything. Holt could not claim distance from documents that bore his own instructions in his own hand. Aldred filed on the 8th and sent confirmation by telegraph at noon. Cole read it in the kitchen and set it down and exhaled slowly. The exhale of a man releasing something he had been carrying at arm's length for a very long time. Ada looked at the telegram on the table. She thought about the Danvers, about Ruth's letter, 2 pages of tight handwriting from a woman who had been waiting 6 months for somewhere to put her anger, about Margaret Price, precise and careful, who had rehearsed her details so many times they had worn grooves, about Tom Waverley standing up in a room and being angry out loud for the first time instead of ashamed. She thought about what none of them had known 6 months ago, or a year ago, or 2 years ago when Holt had first started acquiring land through company names nobody recognized, that they were not each having their own private misfortune, that there was a pattern, that the pattern had a name, and that naming it was most of the work. It's not done yet, Ada said. No. Cole looked at the telegram, but it's real now. Holt made his last move 4 days after the filing. Not through Pruitt at the bank, not through a letter, not through the subtle architecture of implication and social pressure he had been using for 2 years. He sent 3 men to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon, while Cole was working the south boundary fence. Ada answered the door. The man in front was broad and deliberate and holding a document with the posture of someone who expected the document to do the persuading. County writ, he said, authorizing temporary seizure of this property pending resolution of the outstanding mortgage dispute. Ada took the document. Read it standing in the doorway. The reading took 30 seconds, which was 20 seconds longer than she needed. But she used the extra 10 to make sure she was right before she spoke. The county seal had the wrong number of stars. The Red Willow County seal had 13, arranged in a particular pattern she had seen on approximately 40 official documents over the past 3 months. This one had 11. The arrangement was different. And the date on the document was the 30th of November, which was 8 days before Aldred had filed with the Territorial Attorney General's office. Any seizure proceeding initiated after that filing date fell under automatic federal review stay, which meant either this document had been prepared before anyone knew a filing was coming, which made it preemptive and therefore legally meaningless, or someone had backdated it, which made it fraudulent. Either way, it had the wrong seal. This isn't a valid county writ, Ada said. The man blinked. Ma'am, I was told. A county writ requires the correct county seal. This seal has the wrong number of stars and the wrong configuration. She turned the document over and then back. It's also dated 8 days before the amended complaint was filed with the Territorial Attorney General, which means even if the seal were correct, any execution would be automatically stayed under territorial jurisdiction. She held the document out to him. Take this back to whoever gave it to you. Tell them it didn't work, and tell them that this document is now additional evidence of interference with legal process, because it goes to Aldred in Billings today. The man took the document. He looked at it. He looked at his 2 companions. He looked at the document again with the expression of someone who had been handed an object and was now understanding it was not what he had been told it was. He left without another word. All 3 of them rode away down the ranch road, and Ada stood in the doorway and watched them go and let herself breathe. Cole had come in from the south boundary during the last part of it. He came inside and stood in the kitchen and looked at Ada with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when he was managing something stronger than he wanted to show. You just sent 3 men away with a forged writ, he said. The forgery was careless. The seal detail alone would have caught it in any county clerk's office. Most people don't check seal details. Most people haven't spent 3 months reading county documents for evidence of fraud. She set the writ on the desk. This goes to Aldred today. It's the most direct evidence we have of Holt personally directing illegal interference with the legal process, because a forged county writ doesn't get produced without someone at the top authorizing it. Cole crossed the kitchen and took her hand, not as a gesture, not performing anything, simply reached out and took her hand the way you took hold of something you had been moving toward for a long time and had finally stopped finding reasons to delay. Ada looked at their hands and then up at him. "Almost over," Cole said. "Almost," she said. And then a real conversation. And then a real conversation. He didn't let go and she didn't either. The Territorial Attorney General's office moved in the third week of December. 2 investigators arrived on a Wednesday. By Thursday, Pruitt at the bank had given a full statement in exchange for reduced personal liability, confirming that every accelerated mortgage call had been made under explicit direction from Holt, not independent banking judgment. By Friday, the county assessor's office was under administrative review, and Chester Doane had filed a corrected assessment on Cole's property, restoring it to its accurate value. On Saturday, Douglas Holt was served with a criminal complaint, quietly, without the kind of spectacle he had always deployed as a weapon. The trial opened on the 4th of March in Billings. Ada and Cole made the journey together, arriving the evening before and staying at a boarding house 2 streets from the courthouse. Aldred met them in the corridor on the morning of the first day, brisk and focused, with the unhurried manner of a man who had learned that patience was more effective than urgency in front of witnesses. Cross's testimony went in well, Aldred told them. The written direction from Holt is the spine of the prosecution's case. His attorney tried to challenge Cross's credibility given the plea arrangement, but the documentary evidence stands regardless of Cross. The documents say what they say. He looked at Ada. "You're on this afternoon." Ada took the stand at 2 o'clock. The courtroom was fuller than she had expected. Holt sat at the defense table, with the controlled stillness of a man who had spent a great deal of his life being composed in rooms where things were being decided. He looked at her when she sat down and she looked back at him. The easy pleasantness he had worn like a coat for 2 years was gone. What was underneath it was harder to name, not remorse. Something more like a man who had made a calculation and had gotten the variables wrong, and was now sitting in the outcome of that error. Aldred walked her through the testimony with methodical precision. The arrival at Red Willow Station, the work at the ranch and the discovery of the financial pattern, the second ledger, the assembled documentation, the connection through Frank Cutter's notary stamp across every transaction, each piece in sequence, each dated, each sourced, presented with the same precision she had used when she first opened a ledger in the community hall 2 months prior. Holt's attorney was competent and prepared. He began his cross-examination with Ada's background, the boarding house in Laramie, the mail order arrangement that had brought her to Montana, the circumstances of her arrival. "Miss Vance, you came to Red Willow County as a mail-order bride, specifically in response to correspondence initiated by my client. Is that correct?" "It is. And the arrangement did not proceed as you had expected. The arrangement was ended by your client without notice. I traveled 800 miles on the basis of an invitation he sent, and a promise he made and chose not to keep. You were disappointed. I was deceived. There is a meaningful difference. Is it possible that your disappointment influenced the conclusions you drew from the documents you reviewed? That a woman who felt wronged by Douglas Holt might interpret ambiguous evidence in the most damaging possible light?" Ada looked at him calmly. "The documents don't have feelings. They have dates and amounts and signatures. I reported what was in them. But your interpretation of those documents?" "My interpretation is corroborated by Frank Cutter's sworn testimony, by the written correspondence between Holt and Cutter that Cutter produced directly, and by 3 families who experienced the identical sequence of events, in the identical order across an 18-month period." She kept her voice even, not combative, simply precise. "If my interpretation is shaped by personal feeling, so is the arithmetic, and the arithmetic doesn't change." A small sound moved through the courtroom. The judge, a compact man from outside the county, who had taken the case after the original presiding judge, had quietly recused himself when the Territorial Attorney General's involvement made the conflict of interest impossible to ignore. Looked at his notes with an expression that suggested he was not entirely successful at suppressing something. Holt's attorney moved to a different line of questioning and did not return to that one. Ada stepped down from the stand at 4 o'clock. Aldred met her in the corridor. That, he said, was the clearest I have ever heard a lay witness handle a hostile cross-examination. He was trying to make me the question instead of the evidence, Ada said. I've dealt with that approach before. Cole was waiting at the end of the corridor. He had watched the testimony from the gallery. He looked at her as she came toward him, and his expression was the unguarded one, the one she had spent months learning to recognize and had never taken lightly. You told a lawyer the arithmetic didn't have feelings, he said. He deserved it. Cole almost smiled. Are you all right? She thought about it honestly. Yes, I actually am. The verdict came on a Wednesday. Guilty on 7 counts. Fraud, criminal conspiracy, fraudulent notarization by proxy, obstruction of legal process. 2 counts of coercion against affected property owners. Pruitt at the bank received a separate civil judgment, removed from his position, fined, his banking license suspended for 5 years. The restitution orders for all 5 affected families were confirmed and scheduled for enforcement within 60 days. Aldred sent the confirmation by telegraph. Cole came into the kitchen where Ada was working on a correspondence file for Alice Dormer, whose creditor situation she had resolved in February with a letter so thoroughly documented that the creditor had reduced the claimed debt by half without a single court filing. Cole read her the telegram without preamble, and she set down her pen and sat with it for a moment. She thought about Ruth Danvers' letter, the tight handwriting. If you are truly trying to stop this man. She thought about Nora Briggs reaching under the counter for her stool. Sit down. This is going to take a few minutes. She thought about a community hall on a December afternoon and Dale Peck sitting back down slowly and Tom Waverly standing up. We did it, she said. You did it, Cole said. We, she said firmly. Cole, I built the case. But you gave me the foundation, the room and the table and the time and the wages that let me stay long enough to see the pattern. And you believed me without conditions when Holt was calling me a thief to your face. She held his gaze. Don't make yourself smaller in this to make me larger. That's not what happened. Cole sat down across from her. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands. When he looked up, something had released in his face. Not softened or weakened, but released. The way a thing released when it had been held under pressure for too long and was finally allowed to find its natural shape. I've been alone for 6 years, he said, and I convinced myself it was easier. That caring about something again meant risking losing it again, and I didn't know if I had the capacity for that. A pause. I stopped believing that somewhere around the 2nd week you were here. I just didn't know how to say it. Why not? Because you had your own things to survive, and it didn't seem right to add weight to what you were already carrying. Ada looked at him. Cole Whitmore. I have a ledger and a resolved case and a signed lease on an office, and I am not carrying anything I cannot manage. She paused. You do not need to protect me from your own feelings. I can hold them. Cole's jaw shifted, and then he laughed. Not the almost law, not the controlled movement at the corner of his mouth that she had been cataloging for months. A real one. Full and warm and a little rough from years of disuse, and entirely the most genuine sound she had ever heard in that kitchen. You've known, he said. For how long? Longer than is dignified, Ada said. I was waiting for the right moment. Is this it? Holt is finished. Your mortgage is safe. The Danvers have their restitution. I have a signed lease. She looked at him steadily. Yes, this is it. He reached across the table and took her face in both hands, careful and certain, and kissed her in the lamplight of the kitchen that had stopped being just a workplace sometime in December and had become, without either of them deciding it formally, the place where everything important happened. When he pulled back, he kept his hands where they were. Marry me, he said. Ada blinked. That was direct. I've been thinking about it for 2 months. We've known each other for 5 months. I know. Is that a no? She thought about with all my heart written in careful handwriting by a man who had never once meant it. She thought about what those same words would mean, said by this man in this kitchen with the winter outside, Dean Armiton, and everything they had built together on the table between them. Ask me again in the spring, she said. When the iris bulbs come up. Cole looked at her. The ones I cleared the debris off of. Those are the ones, she said. He was quiet a moment. Spring, he said. Spring, she confirmed. He didn't let go of her hands, and she didn't move to take them back, and in that kitchen, in the lamplight, with the winter settled hard around the house, and the spring somewhere ahead, neither of them was afraid of waiting, because waiting meant there was something worth waiting for. And that alone was more than either of them had expected to have again. Spring came the way Montana spring always came, late and unconvinced, and then suddenly, overwhelmingly present, as though the season had been saving itself. The iris patch on the south side of the house pushed through in the second week of April. 6 tight purple blooms that Ada had been checking every morning for 3 weeks without telling Cole. She told him on a Tuesday. She walked into the kitchen where he was already at the stove and said without preamble, "They're up, 6 of them. I checked this morning." Cole turned from the stove and looked at her, really looked at her. Not the careful, measured look he had used in November when she was a stranger he was trying not to presume about, and not the focused look he used when they were working through a problem together, the one she had no cataloging word for except true. "You've been checking every morning for 3 weeks. I wanted to be accurate about the timing." He set down what he was holding and crossed the kitchen. "Will you marry me?" he said. "I told you it wasn't a no," Ada said. "You made me wait until spring. You needed the time. Not to decide, I think you decided in December, but to know that the decision would hold when there was nothing left to fight. When it was just the work and the ranch and the ordinary weight of a life without a crisis holding it together." She looked at him without flinching from any of it. "Some things only feel real under pressure. I needed to know this wasn't one of them." Cole looked at her for a long moment and then said quietly, and without any decoration at all, "And now you know." "And now I know," she said. He took her face in his hands the way he did things that mattered to him, carefully and without hesitation, and kissed her in the April light coming through the kitchen window, with the 6 iris blooms visible past his shoulder, blooms that June had planted and that had come up every spring for 6 years, while Cole stood at a careful distance from them, because looking at them directly had felt like something he didn't yet know how to do. He knew now. When he pulled back, he stayed close. Ada looked at him in the morning light of the kitchen that had become, over 4 months of coffee and ledgers and the specific intimacy of fighting something hard together, the place she thought of when she thought of the word home. She had thought of that word differently at different points in her life. It had meant the house she grew up in. It had meant the boarding house room in Laramie, in the inadequate way that a place where you sleep but don't belong could be called anything. It had meant, briefly and falsely, the future Douglas Holt's letters had described. And then it had meant a ranch 4 miles north of Red Willow, with a spare room and a lock on the door and coffee, which was the one thing the man living there had gotten right. She understood now that home wasn't a place you arrived at. It was something you built. From work and honesty, and the specific courage of staying when leaving would have been easier. From 2 people who had each lost something they hadn't expected to survive losing, deciding, carefully and with their eyes open, that what they could build together was worth more than the safety of building nothing. They were married on the 15th of April. Ruth Danvers stood up for Ada. Tom Waverly stood up for Cole, which surprised everyone in the county, including Cole, and Tom explained it simply. "You started the fight. Seemed right, I should be there at the finish." Nora Briggs made the cake without being asked, appearing 2 days before the ceremony with flour and butter, and the serene efficiency of a woman who understood that her contributions were necessary and did not require an invitation to be legitimate. The office on the main road opened the following Monday. Ada Vance, the sign read, and she kept it that way, because that was the name people knew, and names earned through work were worth keeping. 3 letters waited on the desk the first morning. 2 from women in the county. 1 from Alice Dormer in Billings, who had told 2 people about what Ada had done with her creditor situation, and those 2 people had told others. Ada read all 3, picked up her pen, began. By summer she had 9 regular clients, by fall 17. The second desk went in that October, and the woman she found to sit at it was a former schoolteacher from Wyoming, who understood numbers and had nowhere particular to be, and who, Ada noted, had arrived in Red Willow on the afternoon train with a small bag and an expression that Ada recognized immediately, and had been watching for without realizing it. The railroad confirmed the North Valley Spur line in April of the following year. Land values in the county would triple, the papers reported. Cole rode into town on a Thursday and found Ada at her desk and set the telegram in front of her. She read it. Thought about the Danvers and the Prices and Tom Waverly sitting with land that was now worth 3 times what Holt had tried to take it for. Thought about the shape of what Holt had built, and the shape of what had dismantled it, which was not heroism exactly, just someone arriving with nothing, and deciding that not enough was not the same as nothing at all. That same evening, sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight with the spring dark outside, and the sound of the land settling into itself, the way it did at the end of a long day, Ada told Cole the things she had been waiting for the right moment to say for 2 weeks. There would be someone else in the house by autumn. Someone not yet ready for the world, but coming. Cole looked at her across the table, and for the first time in 7 years he did not think about what the house had been. He thought only about what it was becoming. Not a monument to what was lost. A living thing, reaching forward, the way living things did when they had room enough and good ground under them, and someone who believed in the spring. He reached across the table and took her hand. Outside, the Montana dark moved through the grass with the patience of something that had always been on its way, and had simply been waiting for the right conditions to arrive.